What starts as a routine evening for Major Ethan Reynolds turns into a tense confrontation when a suspicious officer, Ryan Carter, approaches him in a quiet parking lot. What unfolds challenges Ethan and his wife, Sophia, to confront deep-seated biases, forcing everyone involved to face uncomfortable truths. As tensions rise, lines between right and wrong blur, and both Ethan and Ryan must grapple with the consequences of their choices. Can justice prevail when power is misused? And can those responsible find redemptions? If you're ready for a story packed with emotional twists, personal growth, and the fight for justice, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's dive into the story. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the parking lot. Ethan Reynolds sat in his car, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for his wife, Sophia, to finish shopping. It was a routine Saturday quiet, predictable. He had taken this time to decompress, reflect on the week, and enjoy the stillness of the evening. Ethan was a man of discipline, a decorated major in the U.S. Army. He had spent years serving his country, traveling to places where most people dared not go, and returning with medals pinned to his chest. But no matter how much he had done, there were always moments that reminded him how little it seemed to matter when it came to everyday life. The battles weren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they were fought in quiet, unseen ways, through looks, words, or a lack of acknowledgement. Today would be one of those battles. Sophia had insisted on stopping at a boutique to pick up something for an event they had later that week. Ethan didn't mind. It gave him time to relax in the car, his safe space. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 15 minutes. She'd be out soon. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars spaced around the large lot. The air felt crisp, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of nearby trees. It was peaceful. And then Ethan spotted a police cruiser pulling into the lot. At first, he didn't think much of it. There was no reason to. But as the car crept closer, parking 2 spots behind him, his senses heightened. He knew the feeling years in the military had taught him to be aware of his surroundings, to trust his instincts. He exhaled, his muscles instinctively tensing. The officer sat in the cruiser for a moment before stepping out. Ethan caught the sight of him in his rearview mirror, a man in his mid-40s with a thick, weary look. His badge glinted in the evening light as he adjusted his belt and approached Ethan's car. Ethan rolled down the window halfway, keeping his hands resting on the wheel. His training kicked in. Stay calm. Don't escalate. The officer stopped beside his car, looking down at Ethan with a scrutinizing gaze. Evening, the officer said, his voice casual but tinged with something else, a note of suspicion. Evening, Ethan replied, his tone neutral. Is there a problem? The officer glanced around the parking lot, then back at Ethan. What are you doing here? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Waiting for my wife, he replied, nodding toward the store. She's shopping. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing Ethan's words. There was no accusation yet, but Ethan could sense it coming. He had seen this before. There was a familiarity to this kind of interaction, one he had hoped to avoid today. The officer leaned closer. This your neighborhood? Ethan's jaw tightened. The patrol car, its engine rumbling to life just seconds after she pulled onto the road. Just asking, the officer said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He looked over the car as if expecting to find something out of place. The silence between them stretched out, uncomfortable, thickening the air. Ethan remained composed, though a subtle tension was building in the pit of his stomach. He had dealt with these situations before. They didn't always escalate, but when they did, it was rarely because of something he did. The officer cleared his throat. We've had some calls about suspicious activity in the area, he said, his gaze flicking to the inside of Ethan's car. Just being cautious. Ethan took a slow breath. The officer's tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, a challenge lurking beneath the surface. He knew the drill. Suspicious activity often served as code for something else, something unspoken, but felt in every interaction like this one. I'm just sitting here, Ethan said evenly. There's nothing suspicious about that. The officer seemed to mull that over for a moment, but instead of backing off, he leaned into the tension. "You mind if I see some ID?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the wheel. There was no reason for this. He hadn't done anything wrong, but refusing could only make things worse. He reached for his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were handling a bomb. He handed the officer his military ID, the one with his name Major Ethan Reynolds clearly visible. The officer glanced at the ID but said nothing. Instead, he stared at it a beat too long, then handed it back without acknowledgement. "Military, huh?" the officer asked, his tone flat. "That's right," Ethan replied. The officer didn't respond immediately. His silence hung in the air, and Ethan could sense what was coming next. He could practically hear the thoughts running through the officer's head, the assumptions, the doubts, the way he was being measured and judged, not by the content of his character or his actions, but by something else entirely. "Why don't you step out of the car for a second?" the officer asked. There it was. The line had been crossed. Ethan's stomach twisted, but he kept his face calm. He didn't move. "Is there a reason I need to step out?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The officer's eyes hardened slightly, his stance growing more rigid. "It's just a routine check," he said. "I'd appreciate your cooperation." Ethan knew where this was going. He'd seen this play out in countless stories on the news, in conversations with friends, in his own experiences. But he wasn't going to give in so easily. "With all due respect, officer," Ethan began, "I'm sitting here, in my car, waiting for my wife. There's no need for me to get out." The officer's expression shifted ever so slightly, his patience wearing thin. "I don't have to explain myself to you. Step out of the vehicle." Before Ethan could respond, he saw Sophia walking out of the store, a few shopping bags in hand. She was smiling at first, her steps light as she approached the car, but as she got closer, she noticed the officer standing by Ethan's window. Her smile faded, replaced by concern. Sophia was a civil rights lawyer, sharp and unafraid to challenge anyone who overstepped their authority. She had seen this scenario play out too many times, and she could sense the tension the moment she saw the officer's rigid posture. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of edge as she reached the car. The officer turned to her, his face tightening as he assessed her. "Just a routine check," he replied curtly. Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. "A routine check for sitting in a parking lot." The officer bristled. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Just making sure everything's in order." Sophia wasn't having it. "I'm sure you are," she said, her tone cool. "But I think we both know this isn't about suspicious activity." The officer's eyes flashed, and for a moment he looked like he was going to say something sharp in return. But before he could, Ethan spoke up. "We were just leaving," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "If there's no issue, we'll be on our way." The officer's jaw clenched, clearly unhappy with the turn of events. But with Sophia now standing beside Ethan, her gaze hard and unyielding, the officer seemed to reconsider. After a long, tense moment, he stepped back. "Just be careful," he muttered, turning and walking back to his cruiser. Ethan exhaled, the tension finally releasing from his shoulders. Sophia placed a hand on his arm, her expression softening with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, but his mind was still reeling. He had been through much worse in his life war zones, dangerous missions, but somehow, moments like these always left him feeling a different kind of vulnerability. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice carried a weight that told her otherwise. They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the officer drove away, leaving them in the dimming light of the parking lot. The air felt heavy, and the peace of the evening had been shattered. But they both knew that this wasn't over, not really. Ethan and Sophia drove home in silence. The confrontation with Officer Ryan Carter lingered in the air like a bad taste, thick with unspoken emotions. The quiet hum of the car provided little comfort as Ethan stared ahead, lost in thought. Sophia could sense the heaviness in her husband, the way he kept replaying the encounter in his mind. She had seen him in combat zones, surviving situations that would break most people, but there was something different about these moments. It was a quieter kind of battle, one that left no physical scars but etched deep wounds in his soul. "That was more than just routine," Sophia finally said, breaking the silence. She looked over at Ethan, her voice steady but concerned. He wasn't just checking IDs. He was testing you. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened. I know. Sophia sighed, leaning back in her seat, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She had spent years as a lawyer, fighting cases like this, fighting to prove what should be obvious, that everyone, regardless of who they are, deserves to be treated with dignity. But seeing it happen to her husband, watching it unfold in real time, made it feel personal in a way that even her toughest cases hadn't. Ethan's voice cut through her thoughts. It's the same thing, over and over. It doesn't matter how much I've done or where I've been. To him, I'm just another guy sitting in a parking lot, and that's enough for suspicion. Sophia reached over, placing her hand gently on his arm. You're more than that. We both know it. Something was coming, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. They both knew the reality they faced, and it weighed on them heavily. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Officer Ryan Carter was stewing in frustration. His partner, Officer Caleb Mitchell, sat nearby, scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing up at Ryan with curiosity. Caleb hadn't said much during the encounter with Ethan and Sophia, but he had noticed Ryan's demeanor shift the way his voice had carried an edge that didn't feel right. Ryan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I don't get it, man, he muttered, more to himself than to Caleb. You can't even do your job anymore without someone accusing you of profiling. I was just doing my job. Caleb glanced up, unsure how to respond. He was new to the force and had been partnered with Ryan for only a few months. Ryan was a seasoned co-prospected, but lately something had changed in him. Caleb couldn't put his finger on it, but Ryan's frustration seemed to run deeper than just the job. There was bitterness there, something that festered. I mean, Ryan continued, clearly agitated, the guy's sitting in a car in a mostly empty lot. That's suspicious, right? And then his wife lawyer or not steps in like, I'm the one in the wrong. They think they can just, he trailed off, shaking his head. Caleb shifted in his seat. He had noticed the racial undertones in Ryan's words, the way Ryan had handled the situation, but he didn't feel comfortable calling him out on it. Not yet. I don't know, man, Caleb said cautiously, trying to navigate the conversation. Maybe next time we just handle it differently. Ryan shot him a look. Handle it differently. What? Just let people sit around wherever they want without checking things out. We're supposed to keep order, Mitchell. Not just let anyone do whatever they want because we're afraid of a little backlash. Caleb nodded, though his unease grew. He didn't have the experience or authority to challenge Ryan yet, but something about the way Ryan framed everything, the U.S. versus them mentality, didn't sit right. Ryan stood up abruptly, tossing his chair back with frustration. I need to clear my head, he muttered, walking out of the office. Caleb watched him go, unsure of where all this was headed, but certain that something was wrong. The next morning, Ethan and Sophia sat at their kitchen table, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Sophia had spent most of the night replaying the confrontation in her mind. As a lawyer, her first instinct was to seek justice, to act. But this situation felt more complicated. They could file a complaint, but she knew how these things played out slowly, quietly, with little resolution. I think we need to report what happened, she said, breaking the quiet as she sipped her coffee. Ethan looked up, his face still lined with the exhaustion of the previous night. And what good will that do? We file a report, they investigate, and nothing changes. I've seen it happen before. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes focused. Maybe? But we can't just let it go, Ethan. This isn't just about us. It's about stopping it from happening to someone else, someone who doesn't have the same resources or connections we do. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know you're right, but it's hard to fight a battle that feels never-ending. Sophia reached across the table, taking his hand. That's why we have to keep fighting. You don't win every battle, but if you stop fighting, you lose for sure. Ethan gave her a small, grateful smile. He admired her tenacity, the way she never backed down from what she believed was right. But he also knew how exhausting it could be. All right, he said finally. Let's report it. Sophia nodded, already making a mental list of steps they needed to take. She had connections in the legal world and in politics, people who could help push the complaint forward. But she also knew it wouldn't be easy. It never was. Sophia spent the next few days gathering all the necessary information to file a formal complaint. She worked with a sense of purpose, her mind sharp and focused. She reached out to a colleague who specialized in civil rights cases and outlined what had happened. They drafted a formal complaint to the police department, detailing Officer Ryan Carter's actions and their concerns about racial profiling. As they prepared the documents, Sophia felt a familiar fire burning inside her. This wasn't the first time she had fought against systemic injustice, but it felt different when it hit so close to home. She was determined to see this through no matter how long it took. Ethan, meanwhile, tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that parking lot, to the officer's condescending tone and the way he had felt like a suspect for simply existing in a space that wasn't deemed his. It was a feeling that gnawed at him, one that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He had fought in wars, led men into battle, and returned with honors. But here, in his own country, he was still seen as something less than something other. And that, more than anything, was what hurt the most. 2 weeks passed before Sophia received a response from the police department. It was a carefully worded letter, thanking them for their complaint and assuring them that the matter would be looked into. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a vague promise of an investigation. Sophia read the letter aloud to Ethan as they sat on their porch one evening, the sun casting long shadows across their yard. She could feel the frustration rising in her chest as she read each sterile, bureaucratic sentence. "They're not going to do anything," Ethan said, his voice heavy with resignation. "It's all just words to cover themselves." Sophia frowned, folding the letter and setting it aside. "We're not done yet. If they won't take it seriously, well, go higher. I'll contact the city council. I'll call in favors if I have to." Ethan admired her resolve, but he wasn't sure how much more he could take. The emotional toll of reliving the encounter was weighing on him, and he wasn't sure if he had the energy to keep fighting a system that seemed determined to ignore the truth. "I just don't want this to consume us," he said quietly. "I don't want to spend the next 6 months fighting a losing battle." Sophia softened, reaching for his hand. "We won't let it consume us. But we can't let it go either. This is bigger than us, Ethan." He nodded, though the weight of it all felt like a heavy stone in his chest. At the police station, Officer Ryan Carter was dealing with the fallout of Sophia's complaint. His supervisor, Captain David Turner, had called him into the office for a meeting, and Ryan knew it wasn't going to be good. As he sat across from Turner, his stomach churned with anger and frustration. He had heard about the complaint and knew that Sophia was pulling strings to get him investigated. "You know why you're here," Turner said, his voice measured but stern. "There's been a complaint filed against you by the Reynolds. They're accusing you of racial profiling." Ryan scoffed, unable to hide his bitterness. "Profiling, I was doing my job. That's all." Turner studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Ryan, we've been getting more and more complaints like this lately. You need to be careful. People are watching, and they're not going to let this slide." Ryan's jaw tightened. "So what? We're just supposed to back down every time someone accuses us of something I didn't do anything wrong." Turner sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I'm not saying you're guilty of anything, but perception matters, especially in today's climate. We can't afford to have officers making people feel targeted. You need to be smarter about how you handle these situations." Ryan bristled at the words. He didn't need a lecture on how to do his job. He had been on the force for years, long before all this talk of bias training and community policing became the norm. To him, it felt like the world was changing too fast, and people like him were being left behind. Turner's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're going to have to investigate this. You'll be on administrative leave until we can clear this up." Ryan's stomach dropped. "You're suspending me." "Not suspending. Administrative leave." "It's temporary?" Turner said, though Ryan could hear the finality in his tone. Ryan stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. All because some lawyer and her husband didn't like being questioned." Turner watched him, his expression cool. This is how it works now, Ryan. You either adapt, or you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of things. Ryan stormed out of the office, his mind racing with fury. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, and yet, here he was, being punished for it. As he walked out into the cool evening air, he swore to himself that he wouldn't let this go. What did he say? As the days passed, Ethan tried to put the incident behind him, but it lingered in his mind like a shadow that refused to fade. He kept replaying the encounter with Ryan, the way the officer had looked at him, the words he had used, subtle but sharp, designed to cut. Sophia noticed the change in him. He was quieter, more withdrawn, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. Layla's stomach dropped at the confirmation. Ethan had always been the type to carry his burdens silently, never letting anyone see how deeply they affected him. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Sophia turned to him, her eyes soft with concern. "You don't have to carry this alone, you know," she said gently. Ethan looked at her, his expression tired but grateful. "I know, but it's hard not to." Sophia reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together, and we're going to get through it." Ethan nodded, though the heaviness in his chest remained. He knew she was right, but there were some battles that felt like they would never end. Officer Ryan Carter paced back and forth in his small apartment, his mind racing with anger and frustration. He had been placed on administrative leave for the past week, a punishment he believed was completely unfair. His thoughts spiraled. He had done nothing wrong, at least nothing that any other officer wouldn't have done. Why was he being targeted? The more he thought about it, the more bitter he became. It wasn't just Ethan and Sophia Reynolds who had put him in this position. It was the whole system, a system that had changed too much in recent years, making officers like him feel like they were constantly walking on eggshells. He felt abandoned by his department, by his superiors, and even by Caleb Mitchell, his rookie partner, who hadn't stood up for him when the complaint was filed. Ryan grabbed his phone and scrolled through social media, seeing the outrage building online. People were talking about the incident, calling for his firing, accusing him of racial profiling. Some local blogs had even picked up the story, painting him as the villain without ever hearing his side. He clenched his fists, feeling a rising sense of desperation. He needed to do something. He couldn't let this smear his name and destroy his career. He had to act before everything slipped away. Meanwhile, at home, Ethan Reynolds was grappling with his own thoughts. The complaint had been filed, but the police department's response was slow and unsatisfying. Every day that passed without resolution felt like a weight on his chest. He wanted to move on, but the frustration gnawed at him. Why did this keep happening? Why was it that, despite all he had accomplished, despite serving his country, he was still treated with suspicion? Sophia noticed the strain in Ethan's face as he sat at the kitchen table staring at his coffee. She sat down beside him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "They're going to investigate, Ethan," she said softly. "But we knew this wouldn't be quick." Ethan nodded but didn't speak right away. He was trying to find the right words to express how he felt, how tired he was. "I'm just not sure how much longer I can keep doing this," he finally said. "I'm tired, Sophia. Tired of always being seen as something less." Sophia's heart ached for him. She had seen him face down much more dangerous situations with unwavering courage. But this was different. It was insidious, a quiet battle that wore him down over time. "I know," she said, her voice full of empathy, "but we can't let them win by giving up. We're fighting for more than just us. We're fighting for everyone who has to deal with this." Ethan met her eyes and saw the fire in her that had always drawn him to her. She was right. This wasn't just about him or his pride. This was about setting a precedent, about standing up to a system that had to change. He couldn't walk away from that. He took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "You're right. We have to see this through." Back at the police station, Captain David Turner was reviewing the case against Ryan Carter. The department had launched an internal investigation, and now, after weeks of gathering statements and reviewing body cam footage, the evidence was becoming clear. The footage from that night didn't show any physical violence, but it showed something almost worse: the hostility in Ryan's tone. the dismissiveness toward Ethan's military background, and the condescension in every word exchanged. There was no explicit slur, no obvious breach of protocol, but the underlying bias was hard to ignore. Turner sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. He had known Ryan for years. He wasn't a bad cop, but somewhere along the way, something had changed in him. Turner knew he had to act, not just for the department's reputation, but because it was the right thing to do. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Commissioner Harper, we need to talk about Officer Carter. I've reviewed the footage and it's not good." Ryan was growing restless, stuck in limbo while the investigation dragged on. His bitterness had only deepened, and his thoughts became more toxic with every passing day. He had lost his sense of purpose, his grip on what he was fighting for. The more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that Ethan and Sophia were the enemy people who wanted to ruin him because he had the audacity to do his job. He decided he needed to confront someone who had been there that night. He needed to talk to Caleb. Ryan met Caleb outside a small diner where they often grabbed coffee together during their shifts. Caleb looked uncomfortable as Ryan approached him, sensing the tension in the air. "What's up?" Caleb asked cautiously. Ryan didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Why didn't you back me up that night?" Caleb blinked in surprise. "What do you mean I didn't?" "You just stood there while they filed a complaint against me," Ryan interrupted, his voice low and angry. "You didn't say a word in my defense." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if hoping for an escape. "Ryan, I didn't think I needed to. I didn't see anything that would—" "That's the problem," Ryan snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You didn't see it because you've bought into all this nonsense. You think they're right, don't you? You think I was wrong for questioning that guy." Caleb hesitated, then spoke carefully. I think maybe we could have handled it differently." Ryan stared at him, his face hardening. "Handled it differently? So you're saying I was wrong? You think I'm some kind of racist now?" Caleb held up his hands, trying to defuse the situation. "No, I'm not saying that." "Well, be fine. Maybe you let your frustrations get the best of you. Maybe we didn't approach the situation the right way." Ryan shook his head, his face twisting in disgust. "You've been on the job for a couple of months, and now you're lecturing me on how to do it. You don't know anything." Caleb opened his mouth to respond, but Ryan had already turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, unsure of what had just happened. Caleb watched him go, his stomach tight with unease. Something was seriously wrong with Ryan, and Caleb feared it was only going to get worse. A week later, the internal investigation had reached its conclusion, and Ryan Carter was called into Captain Turner's office. He had been dreading this moment, but part of him still held on to the hope that the department would side with him, that they would see the complaint as just another frivolous accusation from people trying to stir up trouble. Turner didn't waste time with formalities. He slid a folder across the desk toward Ryan, his face stern. "Ryan, we've completed the investigation, and based on the evidence, it's clear that your conduct that night was unacceptable." Ryan's stomach dropped. "Unacceptable? What are you talking about? I didn't do anything wrong." Turner's expression remained cold. "The footage speaks for itself, Ryan. Your behavior was unprofessional, and the way you handled that situation, particularly your treatment of Mr. Reynolds, crossed a line." Ryan's face flushed with anger. "Crossed a line? I was doing my job." Turner leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You were doing more than that. You let your personal frustrations cloud your judgment. And now, because of that, we have no choice but to take disciplinary action." Ryan's heart raced. "Disciplinary action? What does that mean?" Turner sighed. "Effective immediately, you're being suspended without pay, pending further review by the Commissioner's office. Depending on their recommendation, you could be facing termination." Ryan's world spun. Termination. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being a respected officer to this? "You can't do this to me," Ryan muttered, shaking his head. "You're throwing me under the bus for some baseless accusation." Turner's gaze hardened. "This isn't baseless, Ryan. You crossed a line, and now you have to face the consequences." Ryan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're making a mistake. I'm not the one in the wrong here." Turner didn't flinch. "The decision has been made, Ryan. There's nothing more to discuss." Ryan stormed out of the office, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything he had worked for, his career, his reputation was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ethan and Sophia sat in their living room, the evening light filtering in through the curtains. It had been a long few weeks, filled with meetings, phone calls, and more waiting than either of them had expected. But tonight, they had received a call from the commissioner's office, informing them that Officer Ryan Carter had been suspended without pay, pending further review. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction, a small victory in a much larger fight. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Sophia sat across from him, her face a mixture of relief and satisfaction. "We did it," she said softly. Ethan nodded, though the weight of the experience still hung over him. "Yeah," he replied, his voice quiet, "but it doesn't feel like enough." Sophia looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know, but it's a start. And maybe it'll make a difference, not just for us, but for others." Ethan nodded again, his thoughts drifting. It wasn't the kind of victory that came with fanfare or celebration, but it was something. And in a world where these battles often went unnoticed or unacknowledged, that was enough. For now, Ryan Carter sat alone in his apartment, the darkness of the room mirroring the darkness that had taken root inside him. His suspension was indefinite, and the commissioner's office was conducting their own investigation. He knew it was only a matter of time before he was officially fired. His career was over, and there was no coming back from this. He had no idea what he would do next. Policing was all he had ever known, and now, without it, he felt adrift. The anger that had once fueled him had turned into something colder, something more destructive. As he sat in the silence of his apartment, he thought about Ethan Reynolds. He thought about that night in the parking lot and the choices he had made. He still didn't fully understand how things had gone so wrong, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just about Ethan. It was about something bigger, something that had been festering inside him for years. He had lost his way, and now he was paying the price. Weeks later, Ethan and Sophia found themselves in a new kind of routine one, where they no longer had to worry about complaints, investigations, or confrontations. The police department had implemented new bias training, and though it was only a small step, it was a sign that things were changing. One evening, after another long day of work, Tyler came home looking more exhausted than usual. He had stood up for himself and his community, and though the battle was over, he knew they had made a difference. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Sophia turned to Ethan and smiled. "We're going to be okay," she said softly. Ethan looked at her, feeling the warmth of her words settle in his chest. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Yeah," he agreed. "We are." And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like a long time, Ethan felt a sense of peace. After weeks of hearings, meetings, and the suspension of Officer Ryan Carter, things had finally started to settle. Ethan and Sophia could breathe again, but the scars of the experience lingered. The incident had left them more aware of how quickly things could escalate, and how fragile their peace of mind could be in the face of injustice. Ethan sat on the edge of their bed one evening, deep in thought. He stared at his hands, hands that had once carried the weight of a rifle in battlefields, far from home, but now carried something different, a heaviness that couldn't be easily shaken. Sophia came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, noticing the faraway look in Ethan's eyes. She quietly sat down beside him, her presence grounding him. "You're thinking about it again," she said softly, though it wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. "It's hard not to." Sophia placed a hand on his knee, her touch gentle but firm. "It's behind us now, Ethan. We did what we needed to do, and we made a difference." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. But sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, it's never enough." Sophia understood his frustration. The fight against injustice was never straightforward, and victories were often small, hard-fought, and rarely felt complete. But she knew they couldn't give up, not when they had the platform and the strength to keep pushing for change. "We did our part," she said, "and we'll keep doing our part. But we can't let it consume us. We have to live too." Ethan looked at her, appreciating her wisdom. He knew she was right. They had made their stand, and now it was time to find peace in the little victories. "Yeah," he said quietly, "you're right." Meanwhile, Ryan Carter was struggling to find his way. After being suspended without pay, he had spent most of his time at home, brooding over what had happened. His days had blurred together into a haze of anger and regret. The department's investigation had revealed more than just his conduct. With Ethan, had uncovered a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. Ryan had never thought of himself as a bad cop. He had joined the force to make a difference, to keep people safe. But somewhere along the way, his frustrations with the job, with the changing world, had warped his perspective. He had started seeing everyone through a lens of suspicion, particularly people who didn't look like him, though he had never admitted that to himself. Now, with his career in tatters, Ryan was forced to confront his failures. He had lost the respect of his peers, his position in the community, and even his own self-respect. Late one night, sitting in the dim light of his kitchen, Ryan poured himself another drink. The alcohol dulled the sharp edges of his thoughts, but only temporarily. He couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, not just from the department or from Ethan and Sophia, but from the world itself. The world had changed, and he hadn't been able to keep up. As he stared into his glass, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from his partner, Caleb Mitchell. Caleb hadn't spoken to him much since the investigation started, and Ryan had taken it as a sign that even Caleb had turned against him. "Caleb, hey man, can we talk?" Ryan frowned, staring at the message for a long moment before replying. "Ryan, what do you want to talk about?" "Caleb, just need to clear the air." Ryan's first instinct was to brush him off, but something in Caleb's words made him pause. Maybe it was time to stop running from the truth, to face the mistakes he had made. With a deep sigh, he replied, "Ryan, sure. When?" The next day, Ryan met Caleb at a small coffee shop outside of town. It was a quiet place, far from the eyes of their fellow officers or anyone who might recognize them. Ryan walked in, his face drawn with fatigue, and found Caleb already sitting at a table, nervously stirring his coffee. Caleb looked up when Ryan approached, offering a small, tentative smile. "Hey," he said. Ryan sat down across from him, his expression guarded. "So, what's this about?" Caleb took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Look, I've been thinking about everything that happened. With you, with the complaint. And I don't know. I can't stop feeling like something went really wrong." Ryan tensed, his old defenses rising. "I did my job, Caleb. I don't know why you're second-guessing everything now." Caleb leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not saying you didn't do your job. But Ryan, there was something off about that night. I was standing right there and I could see it." Ryan clenched his jaw. "You've bought into their version of things, haven't you? You think I'm some kind of racist now, just because I did what any cop would have done." Caleb shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. "It's not about labels, Ryan. It's about how you handled it. You didn't treat that guy fairly. You didn't see him as a person, you saw him as a threat from the moment you pulled up. And I can't keep pretending that's okay." Ryan stared at Caleb, his anger boiling beneath the surface, but he couldn't find the words to refute what his partner was saying. Deep down, he knew Caleb was right. He had let his frustration, his bitterness, cloud his judgment. And now he was paying the price. "I don't know how to come back from this," Ryan muttered, his voice breaking. "I've lost everything." Caleb's expression softened. "It's not too late, Ryan. But you have to be willing to face what happened, to own up to your mistakes." Ryan leaned back in his chair, the weight of Caleb's words sinking in. For the first time, he felt the full gravity of what he had done, not just to Ethan and Sophia, but to himself. "I don't know if I can fix it," Ryan said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Maybe not. But you can try." Ethan stood in his study, staring at the medals on the wall. They were symbols of his service, his sacrifices, and yet They felt distant now, like relics from a different life. The incident with Ryan had shaken him in a way that even war hadn't. It wasn't just about the confrontation itself. It was about everything that came after. The questions it raised about his place in a world that still judged him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. He had spent weeks thinking about how to move forward, how to take the next step after what had happened. The complaint had led to Ryan's suspension, and the department had promised changes, but Ethan knew that real change didn't happen overnight. It took time and persistence. Sophia entered the room quietly, watching her husband as he stood lost in thought. "You're thinking about it again," she said gently. Ethan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the medals. "It's hard not to. Sometimes I wonder if anything we did really mattered." Sophia walked over to him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It mattered. You stood up for yourself. You stood up for what was right. And because of that, people are paying attention." Ethan sighed. "It just feels like there's always going to be another battle." "There might be," Sophia said, her voice firm. "But that's why we keep fighting. Because every time we push back, we make it a little harder for them to ignore the truth." Ethan turned to her, seeing the determination in her eyes. She had always been his rock, the one who pushed him to keep going when he felt like giving up. And now, as they stood together, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't stop now." Back at the police department, the fallout from Ryan Carter's suspension was still being felt. The department had come under scrutiny, not just for the way it handled complaints like Ethan's, but for a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Commissioner Thomas Harper had launched a full internal review, bringing in outside consultants to evaluate the department's practices and biases. It was an unprecedented move, one that had been a long time coming. In a meeting with senior officers, Harper laid out his findings. The room was tense as he spoke, his tone measured but unyielding. "We've uncovered a number of issues," Harper said, addressing the room. "There are systemic problems that need to be addressed. Problems with how we handle complaints, problems with how we train our officers, and problems with accountability." Captain Turner sat in the front row, listening carefully. He had been in the department for years, and while he had always prided himself on running a clean operation, even he had to admit that there were blind spots, areas where officers like Ryan had been allowed to operate without enough oversight. Harper continued, his voice carrying a weight of authority. "We're going to be implementing new training programs, new policies, and most importantly, new systems for accountability. This is not optional. We cannot afford to let this go any longer." There were murmurs in the room, some officers nodding in agreement, others bristling at the idea of change. But Harper's message was clear: things were going to be different from now on. As the changes within the department began to take shape, Ethan and Sophia found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Their story had resonated with people across the city, sparking conversations about bias, policing, and the need for systemic reform. Sophia had been invited to speak at a community event about their experience, and as she stood before the crowd, she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just about their story, it was about the countless others who had faced similar struggles but hadn't had the platform or the resources to fight back. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, people of all backgrounds, united by a common desire for justice. "We didn't ask to be part of this fight," Sophia began, her voice clear and strong. "But we couldn't walk away from it either. Because this isn't just about one incident. It's about a system that needs to change." The crowd listened intently as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of experience, of truth. "We all have a role to play in that change," she continued. "Whether we're standing up in our communities, holding our leaders accountable, or simply refusing to be silent in the face of injustice." As she finished her speech, the crowd erupted into applause. Sophia stepped down from the stage, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. Ryan Carter stood outside the precinct, watching as officers came and went. He hadn't been back to the department since his suspension, and now, as he stood there, he wasn't sure if he would ever return. He had been given an opportunity to speak with Commissioner Harper, a chance to explain himself, to own up to his mistakes. It was his last opportunity to salvage what was left of his career, or at least his reputation. As he walked into the building, his heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he had to try. When he sat down across from Harper, the commissioner's expression was unreadable. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Ryan," Harper began. "You've made some serious mistakes, and there's a lot of damage to repair." Ryan nodded, his throat tight. "I know. I lost my way." Harper studied him for a moment, then spoke with a note of sympathy. "It's not too late to find it again. But it starts with owning what you did. No excuses, no justifications. Just the truth." Ryan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. He had spent so long blaming everyone else, Ethan, Sophia, the department, the world. But now, as he sat there, he realized that the only person he could blame was himself. "I messed up," he said quietly. "I let my anger get the best of me, and I took it out on people who didn't deserve it." Harper nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "That's a start, but it's going to take more than words to make things right." Ryan knew that. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might be able to walk it. Several months had passed since the incident that had changed everything. Ethan and Sophia had found a new sense of normalcy, but they knew that the fight for justice was far from over. The changes in the police department were a step in the right direction, but there was still so much work to be done. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset, Sophia turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "What's next for us?" she asked. Ethan smiled softly, his hand resting on hers. "We keep going. We keep fighting. But we also live." Sophia nodded, her heart full of hope. "Yeah, we live." And as they sat there, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Ethan Reynolds walked through the neighborhood park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the ground. The air was warm, with the soft sounds of children playing and birds chirping in the background. It had been a few months since the ordeal with Officer Ryan Carter had concluded. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but Ethan still carried the memories of that night in the parking lot with him. Today, however, was different. Today felt peaceful. As Ethan reached a bench by the lake, he sat down, watching the ripples on the water. This place had become a refuge for him, a space to clear his mind, reflect on the past, and prepare for whatever came next. As he sat there deep in thought, he heard footsteps approaching. Turning his head, he was surprised to see Ryan Carter standing a few feet away. Ryan's face was solemn, and there was a hesitance in his posture. "Ethan," Ryan said quietly, standing a respectful distance away. "Do you mind if I sit?" Ethan considered for a moment, the tension between them lingering like an invisible thread. But after a long pause, he nodded. "Sure." Ryan sat down, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. The two men had not seen each other since the investigation ended, and neither knew how to start this conversation. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Ryan began, his voice low, almost apologetic. Ethan glanced at him. "What brings you here?" Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes cast downward. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About what happened. About how things ended." Ethan remained silent, allowing Ryan the space to speak. He had spent a long time processing his own feelings, but he was curious to hear what Ryan had to say now. "I made a lot of mistakes," Ryan continued, his tone filled with regret. "I let my anger and my frustrations cloud my judgment. I treated you unfairly. I saw things that weren't there because I didn't want to see the truth. And I've been paying for that ever since." Ethan didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of Ryan's words settle in. He could hear the sincerity in Ryan's voice, but he also knew that words alone weren't enough to undo what had been done. Ryan looked up at Ethan, his expression earnest. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I don't expect you to just forget everything that happened. But I needed to tell you that I'm sorry for what I did, for how I treated you. I've been going to counseling, trying to understand why I let myself get to that point, and I realized I have a lot of work to do." Ethan turned to face Ryan, his expression calm but thoughtful. I appreciate you coming here, he said after a long pause. But you're right. This isn't about forgiveness, not entirely. It's about accountability. You had the power in that situation, and you abused it. Ryan nodded, his face tightening as he accepted the truth in Ethan's words. I know, and I've been thinking about that every day. I let my biases control me. I know I can't change what happened, but I want to make sure it doesn't happen again to anyone. Ethan's gaze softened slightly. He could see that Ryan was sincere in his regret, but he also knew that real change came through actions, not just words. Still, the fact that Ryan was here, admitting his mistakes, was a step in the right direction. You've taken the first step by admitting it, Ethan said. We're going to be okay, Layla, he said, his voice steady but soft. Ryan nodded again, his expression one of quiet determination. I'm working on it. I've joined a program at the department to help address these issues, and am trying to learn. It's going to take time, but I'm committed. Ethan considered this for a moment, then spoke with a calm but firm tone. People like me, people of color, don't get to make those mistakes without paying a heavy price. You were lucky to have the opportunity to reflect and rebuild. Most people don't get that chance. Ryan lowered his head. I know. And that's something you'll carry with me. The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past hanging between them. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't filled with hostility or tension, but rather an understanding that, while they couldn't change the past, they could both work toward something better. I won't pretend this fixes everything, Ethan finally said, his voice measured. But I'm glad you're taking responsibility. That's more than a lot of people do. Ryan nodded, his face showing a mixture of relief and humility. Thank you, Ethan. I'll do better. With that, Ryan stood up, offering a small nod before walking away. Ethan watched him go, feeling a sense of closure settle over him. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes that was enough. The days that followed felt lighter. Ethan and Sophia had resumed their normal routines, but the experience with Ryan had left its mark on them both. They knew that the fight for justice was ongoing and that there were many others out there facing the same struggles. But for now, they had found some peace. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the trees, Sophia turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with warmth. You did the right thing, she said softly. Ethan smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. It wasn't easy. Sophia leaned her head on his shoulder. I know, but that's what makes it important. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around them. The world outside was still filled with challenges, but here, in this moment, they had found a bit of stillness, a space where they could just be. I've been thinking, Ethan said after a long pause. Maybe it's time for us to get more involved. Not just in our own fight, but in helping others who are going through the same thing. Sophia lifted her head, intrigued. What do you have in mind? Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with purpose. I've been talking to some folks at the local veterans group, and they're starting a program to help veterans of color who are dealing with discrimination. I think I want to help them with that. Sophia's face lit up with pride. That sounds perfect for you. Ethan smiled, feeling a renewed sense of direction. Yeah, I think it's time I put my experiences to good use. Ryan Carter had returned to his program at the department, working closely with the team tasked with addressing bias in law enforcement. It wasn't easy, and every day felt like a reminder of the mistakes he had made. But he was committed to doing the work, to understanding where he had gone wrong and how he could do better. He had started attending community meetings, listening to the stories of people who had been impacted by police misconduct. It was uncomfortable at times, hearing their anger and pain, but Ryan knew he had to confront these truths if he was going to make any real progress. At one of the meetings, he sat quietly in the back, taking notes as community members shared their experiences. A woman stood up, her voice trembling as she recounted her son's run-in with law enforcement, a situation that had escalated unnecessarily, leaving her son traumatized. Ryan listened closely, his heart heavy. He could see the parallels between her story and what had happened with Ethan. It was a painful reminder of how easily things could go wrong when officers let their biases influence their actions. After the meeting, Ryan approached the woman, introducing himself with humility. "I'm Ryan Carter. I'm a police officer, and I just want to say I'm sorry for what happened to your son." The woman looked at him with surprise, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sorry doesn't change what happened," she said bluntly. Ryan nodded, accepting her response. "You're right, but I'm trying to learn, to be better. I just wanted you to know that." The woman studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll see if your actions match your words." Ryan knew she was right. Words meant little without action, and it was up to him to prove that he was committed to change. Months later, Ethan and Sophia found themselves standing in front of a small crowd at the grand opening of the new community center. The center was dedicated to providing support for veterans and their families, with a special focus on addressing the challenges faced by veterans of color. It had been a project close to Ethan's heart, and today it was finally becoming a reality. Sophia stood beside him, beaming with pride, as Ethan stepped up to the podium to give a speech. "Thank you all for being here today," Ethan began, his voice steady and strong. "This center represents more than just a building. It represents a commitment to standing together, to supporting each other, and to fighting for the rights of those who have served this country, regardless of their background." The crowd applauded, the energy in the room warm and uplifting. "We've all faced challenges," Ethan continued, "but those challenges don't define us. What defines us is how we respond to them, how we lift each other up, and how we keep pushing for a better future." As Ethan finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. He stepped down from the podium, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The investigation had come to an end, and many of the people involved had been brought to justice. Sophia hugged him tightly, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan smiled, holding her close. "We did it." In the months that followed, Ethan and Sophia continued to grow their involvement in the community. The new center became a hub for veterans and families, a place where people could come together to share their stories, find support, and work toward solutions. Ryan Carter, meanwhile, had fully committed to his new role within the department, working to address bias and promote better community relations. It wasn't always easy, and he faced resistance from some of his fellow officers, but he knew that the work was important. One day, as Ryan was leaving a meeting at the department, he ran into Ethan in the hallway. The two men exchanged a brief glance, and for a moment there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the journey they had both been on. Ethan nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Ryan returned the nod, a silent agreement that while they couldn't change the past, they were both working toward a better future. As they went their separate ways, both men felt a sense of resolution, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but that they were walking it in the right direction. The sun was setting on a warm evening as Ethan and Sophia sat on their porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The world around them was still filled with challenges, but they had found their place in it, standing together, fighting for justice, and building something better for the next generation. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sophia reached over and took Ethan's hand. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "And we've still got a long way to go." Sophia nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "But we'll get there." Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side, ready for whatever battles the future might bring. If you enjoyed this story and would love to hear more like it, filled with powerful lessons, compelling characters, and deep emotional journeys, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join our community as we continue to share meaningful stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more. We're committed to bringing you stories that explore important issues, from justice to resilience and everything in between. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on the themes explored in this story. Together, we can keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and well, see you in the next video. Silver Creek was changing, and so were they. A few weeks later, the community held a town-wide celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event, organized by Nia and Martha Sullivan, was a way to bring everyone together, to celebrate the town's journey toward inclusion and justice. The celebration was held in the town square, where people from all walks of life gathered, young and old, black and white, conservative and progressive. It was a symbol of how far Silver Creek had come, and a reminder that the town's future was something everyone could help shape. As the sun set over the square, Ethan and Nia stood together on the main stage, looking out at the crowd. The atmosphere was warm and joyful, filled with laughter and music. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and perseverance. Martha Sullivan took the microphone, her voice carrying across the square. Tonight, we're celebrating more than just the progress we've made. We're celebrating the people who made that progress possible. People like Ethan and Nia, who showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't done this for recognition, but hearing the town come together in support of the changes they had fought for filled her with a sense of pride and fulfillment. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nia danced together under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The future, once uncertain, now felt bright with possibility. And though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, just as they always had. As the years passed, Silver Creek continued to evolve, becoming a beacon of hope for other towns grappling with the same struggles. Ethan and Nia's love story became part of the town's legacy, a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to back down in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't just about love. It was about standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In the end, Silver Creek had become a place where people from all walks of life could live, love, and grow. And though the road had been long and hard, it had been worth every step. Ethan and Nia, together, had built a legacy of love and hope, one that would endure for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content. Thanks for your support, and remember, love and justice always prevail. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a beautiful day, full of possibility. And as Derek looked out, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future, not just for himself and his family, but for the world they were all helping to shape. Mia and Marcus ran into the room, their laughter filling the air as they played a game of tag around the furniture. Jessica followed close behind, her smile bright and warm. Derek turned away from the window and watched his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. They were his reason for everything, for standing tall in the face of adversity, for sharing his story, for doing his part to make the world a better place. And as he looked at their faces, full of love and laughter, Derek knew that the future was bright. It wouldn't always be easy, but it was full of potential, full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to create a world where empathy and understanding prevailed. In the end, that was all he could ask for. As the day wound down, Derek sat back at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last few months. From the confrontation at the electronics store to the inspiring conversations with young people, he had witnessed firsthand how one small action could create lasting change. Every step forward mattered. He logged into his blog and drafted another post, this time focusing on the idea of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. He knew there was more work to do, always more people to reach, more stories to tell. But he felt confident that he was on the right path. As Derek prepared to hit publish, he paused, thinking of everyone who had been following his journey. If you've been inspired by this story and want to be part of a community that stands up for empathy, justice, and change, don't forget to subscribe to the blog. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories about making a difference one step at a time. Together we can build a future that's brighter for everyone. Satisfied, Derek hit the publish button and leaned back in his chair. The work wasn't done, but with every new subscriber, every person who read and connected with his message, he knew they were getting closer to the world they all deserved. And that was worth everything.